One of the biggest and most important challenges facing the state legislature each year is passing the budget. But how difficult will that be with an expected budget shortfall this year of $4 billion? Let's spend 5 minutes with State Representative John Lawrence and hear what he has to say. Representative Lawrence, thanks for joining me.
I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for having me.
Real quickly, before we start on the budget, you have a background, you're bringing experience that is financial in nature with you into this job. Talk about that.
Well, I spent 10 years at JP Morgan in the financial world. And I feel like it gives me some background as we speak to some of the fiscal issues facing the state. The state's in serious financial trouble. And as we look to kind of come to some solutions in what's going to be a difficult time, I feel like at least I bring some background to the situation that will be of help as we look to face these issues.
I'm sure your constituents would appreciate that. Before we get into the particular situation we're in this year, let's just talk generally about where the state gets its money and where the state spends its money for the average person out there who may not know. Let's talk first about where the state gets its money.
Well, as many folks may know, a vast majority of the sums that come in to the Department of Revenue come in either through the income tax or through the sales tax. There's some smaller taxes, liquor and such. But the vast majority of funds come in through those two primary sources.
And we're looking at a chart right now that says 37.9, essentially 38% comes from the personal income tax, about 31% from the sales and use tax. So those two pots are really the biggest pots for the state.
Right.
What about where they spend the money? What are the biggest
As you look at the state budget, the biggest two drivers of spending are education and public assistance. Corrections comes in at kind of a distant third, but really when you're looking at the top three areas that we're spending money on here in this state, it's education, public assistance, and corrections.
And if you add those three together, I believe you pretty much have 80% of the budget. The money spent by the state goes to those three areas.
Everything else falls into that 20%.
Right. Now, if collections this year, as we're told, are running pretty much even or ahead in terms of sales and use tax collections, personal income tax collections, the money the state's bringing in so far, we're about a little ahead. Why are we looking at a $3 or $4 billion shortfall come the end of this fiscal year?
Well, as you look at last year's state budget and where the spending level was last year as a state we spent $28 billion. So where did that money come from? Well, about $3 billion of it, or a little more than 10%, came directly from the federal government in the form of stimulus money or one-time Medicare funding, and those funds aren't going to be there this year. So before we do one thing, before we fund one bridge project or road project or anything else, we're looking at a budget that went from $28 billion to $25. And that's a huge gap. $3 billion, 10% of $28 billion is a big number.
Now, in the past administration, over the last 7-8 years, it seems to be the philosophy was, let's figure out how much we want to spend.
Right.
Now let's figure out where we're going to get that money from. Do you think that's a good way to deal with the budget moving forward from this point on? What's your philosophy representing your constituents' philosophy?
Absolutely not. That philosophy led to a mentality that we want to tax first and ask questions later, and we want to borrow first and ask questions later. And I am not a fan of taking on additional debt, certainly not. At this point, we already have $3,000 to $4,000 in debt per citizen in this state accrued. We don't need to be taking on any more. So as we're looking at what we're going to do going forward, we need to be looking at every line item in the budget. And what are we spending this money on? Is this something that needs to be spent on? Typically the mentality in government is we spent X this year we're going to spend X plus 2.
Right.
We need to take a new approach to things and say, instead of spending X, we need to look at, should we be spending anything at all on you? And kind of go from a baseline of 0 and build up to what's necessary for that particular department.
Well, I know it's going to be quite a challenge. The governor's giving his budget address soon, and you'll be kind of chewing through those numbers, and coming up, the House will start the process and coming up with its own budget numbers, but it's going to be a daunting challenge. Real quickly, if anybody has questions for you, I know that you have a district office, you have a way for people to get in contact with you there, but talk about your website a little bit. Do you find people coming there for information?
I'd be happy to. We've gotten quite a bit of communication through the website so far. We've had folks come into the office in Jennersville. Certainly folks are welcome to stop by here at the Capitol as well. But really the best way to get a hold of us is either by telephone or by email. The phone number there at the office is 869-1602.
And real quick, your website address again?
It's replawrence.com.
Excellent. Very good. Well, thank you for spending a couple of minutes with us.
I'm happy to. Thanks for having me.
If you have any comments or questions about this or any other legislative topic, you can contact Representative Lawrence. That information will be on the screen in a moment. Thanks for spending 5 minutes with State Representative John Lawrence.